You had, for instance, the Holy House of Loreto in Italy. I mean, how do you compete with this if you're a church that's vying for existence?
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
That really cuts to the heart of it. You can't separate the medieval world from its devotion, if not sometimes its obsession with the passion of Christ.
May God grant us the wisdom to discover the right, the will to choose it, and the strength to make it endure. Amen.
Are we taking out the mystery of the resurrection a little bit, maybe, by postulating this without taking into account all of that this was being held by an excommunicated lay person?
What's your opinion on my crusade? May God be pleased with my sacrifice.
Did do a hypothesis that there may have been a transfer from Serbia of the Shroud to Charnay, who was on crusade in Turkey.
Because sometimes truth isn't good enough. Sometimes people deserve more. Sometimes people deserve to have their faith rewarded.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Ever since it was first unveiled to the public in 1355, the Shroud of Turin has been a mystery, one that has sparked endless debates, faith-driven fervor, and more disturbingly, questions that lie at the very core of what we believe about life, death, and the unknown. Some have been calling it a divine relic, the sacred burial cloth of Jesus Christ, but for others, including myself, the truth is far more complicated. This is not just a question of faith, but one of evidence, of history, and even science. And maybe something more. Now, you've heard this story. Jesus was crucified 2,000 years ago, buried in a tomb, and his body wrapped in a cloth. That's what the Shroud of Turin is said to be, right? The very cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after his death. And so an image of a man's body, scorched into the fabric, bearing the marks of the wounds, a spear in the side, nails in the hands, a crown of thorns on the head, are all revealed in the image, and it's haunting. It's a symbol of sacrifice and suffering, a symbol of something that rises above our simple comprehension. But let's stop for a moment and ask, what if the story we've been told for centuries isn't the truth? What if this artifact, this holy relic, isn't what it claims to be? James Day, in his book, The Shroud of Turin, takes us on a journey into the darker recesses of this enigma. And his findings, well, they may make you rethink everything you've been told about the Shroud. In fact, they might just change the way you see history itself. According to Day, there's something deeply flawed in the story of the Shroud of Turin, something that doesn't add up, even in the most generous of lights. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the stuff of conspiracy theories, right? The kind of things that make you roll your eyes and mutter, "Not again." But hear me out. The truth, after all, isn't always convenient, and it rarely fits into neat little boxes. James Day's arguments aren't some fringe theories dreamed up in the dark corners of the internet. It's built on science, on evidence that can't be ignored. He challenges the authenticity of the Shroud, not with wild accusations, but with cold, hard data. The carbon dating, the historical inconsistencies, the lack of records for its existence until the mysterious appearance of it in the 14th century. No one can explain how it got there or who made it. No one can pinpoint its origins with any certainty. It's as if the Shroud appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, and bearing an image It simply defies logic. And let's not ignore the one thing that people often overlook, the carbon dating tests. In the 1980s, scientists tested the shroud, and they concluded it was from the 13th or 14th century. Hardly the time of Christ, but the Vatican, as you might expect, dismissed those results. They've refused to allow further testing. And in doing so, they've cast a veil of secrecy over one of the world's most well-known artifacts. Why? Is it because the results are too damning? Some say it's a hoax, a medieval forgery crafted by skilled artisans looking to profit from a growing religious pilgrimage industry. But what if it's more than that? What if this relic wasn't just created for profit, but to shape history, to rewrite the narrative of Christ's suffering into something more palatable? Dare I say something marketable? You see, the truth might be far stranger than we can imagine. What if this cloth wasn't just an artifact of the past, but a tool, a weapon, a psychological device meant to manipulate the masses? What if it was carefully designed to invoke a reaction in the hearts and minds of those who saw it, to make them question their faith, to elevate an idea, to create a myth that would endure for centuries? And if we talk about the image itself, the mysterious, almost impossible to replicate image of a man's body, how was it formed? Despite decades of research, no one has come up with a definitive explanation. The image doesn't behave like regular paint or dye. It's not simply a photographic negative, as some have suggested. It's as though the image was imprinted into the cloth in a way that defies our understanding of physics and chemistry today. Some have suggested that it's a product of some kind of radiation. Some believe it's evidence of a miraculous event, a supernatural imprint. But is that the truth? Or could it be something far more human? What if the image wasn't created by a divine force, but a human hand, using techniques lost to time? What if the truth is that this shroud was not crafted by God, but by the ambition of men? And yet there's one theory that keeps creeping back into the darkness of this mystery. One theory that refuses to die. What if the shroud is a sign, a message, a clue from another time, another place, another reality? What if it's more than just a relic of the past? What if it's an artifact of something beyond our understanding? A symbol of an unknown truth? Something that links us to a power that's been hidden from us for millennia? As I look into the history of the shroud, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. Maybe it's because we're all too eager to accept the simplest explanation, the one that fits neatly into our worldview. I've learned over the years, sometimes the simplest answers are the ones that are the most dangerous. The truth is always more complicated. And when it comes to the Shroud of Turin, I believe the truth is still out there waiting to be discovered. And maybe it's waiting for someone to finally ask the right question, to see the hidden patterns, to uncover the real history behind this most elusive of relics. Until then, we're left to speculate, to wonder, and to keep looking for the truth in places where it's most likely to hide.
In a world filled with mysteries, there are few as polarizing as this one. A piece of cloth, over 14 feet long, bearing the faint image of a man. Some believe it to be the burial shroud of Christ himself, an imprint left by divine energy. Others say it's nothing more than an elaborate hoax, crafted to deceive the faithful. Scientists have tested it, carbon dating points to the Middle Ages, yet questions remain. Could the tests be flawed? Is there something beyond science, something we're not meant to understand? This is more than a relic. It's a battleground between faith and reason, truth and deception. Every thread of this ancient cloth tells a story, but whose? The answer may lie in the space between faith and science or in the shadows where both fail to reach. Our guest has examined the evidence, weighed it against reason, and has written a book, The Shroud of Turin. He is the hero of skepticism, the questioning gumshoe, the cynical detective. James, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for that introduction.
You're welcome. Tell me about you. Tell me about writing this book.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm a lifelong Catholic, and I'm proud to say, I have a lot of years of Catholic education. I was trained by the Jesuits in high school and college. I worked for them for a few years. I've been in Catholic media, Catholic publishing. This is my 5th book. Previous ones were around popes, cathedrals, St. Michael the Archangel. And it's interesting, during most of the time those books came out, I was researching the Shroud. It took about 6 years from the time I said, okay, I'm really going to dive into trying to get to the bottom of it, to when the book saw the light of day in October of 2024 through Trine Day Press. The title, it's a bit controversial, The Shroud of Turin. At the same time, I needed to, let me put it this way. The original working title was The Shroud and the Stone. Okay, a snooze fest, right? I needed to grab an audience, because I think once you start digging into it, it's not as maybe as controversial as you think. It really starts to kind of just say a really sort of, I don't want to call it run of the mill, but a very kind of orthodox study into medieval passion devotions, which is when the Shroud emerged in the historical record. Okay. I wanted to go into this, Brandon, with I was all in on the Shroud as you said, created by divine energy. I think that's a great way of putting it. I thought the science that was presented to us by pro Shroud authenticists, who were putting the Shroud out in presentations and such, I thought it was remarkable. It seemed it seemed exactly what they seemed to be talking about, that it was an unexplainable thing. My thing then was, I come more from a historical background then. I said, okay, I can't really comment on the science. And by the way, the science, quote unquote, the science, it seems to be you get into a deadlock with the science, because with every offer of one, on the one hand, you have another hand that's saying, well, wait a minute, there's this. And you can kind of get really stuck in the deadlocking of the scientific claims. So what if we just backed off that? This is my thinking. And went into the historical record. And that's really where I started. After about a year of just staying up late and reading as much as I could, I got pretty good at reading French for a while there. I started to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to put the brakes on a little bit about this, because there's just a lot of red flags that were happening at the time when the Shroud, as we know it, entered the historical record.
Yeah, no, that's great, man. The Shroud's been something that comes up in the feed every now and then. There's this new information they've come up with, or somebody's got a new perspective. I'm honestly just looking for perspectives on this too that may help us understand a little bit about where this bit of linen fabric had come from. And that's where I'm really interested in. We have these ancient dates, but there's a whole lot going on in the church. Like you said, there was an entire devotional set up to the passion narrative. Can we talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that really cuts to the heart of it. You can't separate the medieval world from its devotion, if not sometimes its obsession with the passion of Christ. But you need to back up a little bit even further before we get into the medieval world with, for instance, Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor in 800. Charlemagne did something very interesting. He created his cathedral in modern-day Germany based on the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. And that started a kind of trend where you had a layout, architectural layout, which was reminiscent of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This was 200 years, almost 300 years before the First Crusade. So what was the First Crusade but to reclaim the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem, specifically the Holy Sepulchre, from the quote unquote infidel, from Muslim controlled from Muslim control back to Christian control. Once the Crusades fell, and that wasn't viable anymore with the changing world. If one could not journey to Jerusalem as a pilgrim or as a crusader, which is in some ways the same thing, then you brought the Holy Sepulchre back to your area, which for the most part was Frankish modern day France. Most of these crusades, most of these crusaders, the kings of Jerusalem, the kingdom of Jerusalem, they were all basically from modern day France, which is the same place where the Shroud emerged in the mid 1300s in the known historical record. This was in Champagne, Burgundy, modern day Champagne, Burgundy, just south of Troyes, if you want to, Troyes, the capital of Champagne. It's a very interesting, very fertile area because not only this is where the Pope Urban II was from. This is the same place where he called the crusade back in 1095. This is the same place where you had the Templars emerge. Your little band of Templar families formed. They came out of the Champagne area. This is the same area where Bernard of Clairvaux started his Cistercians. His family were also Templar families. Templar families and Cistercians go hand in hand. They were also from Champagne, Burgundy. It's also the same place where the Gothic cathedrals arose, which was a kind of honoring the Holy Sepulchre. And it was also where the Shroud of Turin came out. It was also where the Holy Grail was populated. I just thought it was very interesting that it's all from that same location, and I don't think you can make that. That's not a coincidence to me, Brandon.
So, well, that's the other thing you made an interesting allusion to. You got the Templars mentioned here in the story, and we know that they end up being disbanded and wiped out's probably a better term than disbanded. But there's an interesting, for there to be a tie-in between all of these events, from the church to the Templar families, someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, and the Shroud. This is beginning to be a story of intrigue, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's a mystery. It's a mystery, and it's a wonderful mystery. But it's all rooted in this devotion to the crucified. Suffering is really understood, by those who've undergone suffering, come out of suffering with a kind of wisdom that those who don't lack. And that medieval period was rife with people who suffered. Their way of getting around it was by uniting themselves with the crucified Christ. This was a holy Catholic world. A holy Catholic world. This was a world that lived and breathed its Catholicism. It's hard to understand that these days, but it's also a time when the Middle Ages, Brandon, is a time period of nobles. We don't really know any of the peasants. We know all of the nobles. The noble families who provided the Templars with the knights, the same families that provided the monks of the Cistercians and the Carthusians and the others, the Franciscans. These were the same, the offspring of which were the same families that brought the Shroud into the church south of Troyes in Lorraine. So that's where a lot of hypotheses came out that says, well, okay, once you trace back the families of the Charnay and the Verger families that showed the Shroud in about 1355, oh, look, they're Templar families. So obviously it must have come from the Crusades, and it must have been brought back to France from, say, Constantinople, for instance. The problem is, and this is where the intrigue really comes in, the problem is there is nothing about where the Shroud came from those who presented it. There is nothing other than you have Geoffrey II, the son of the knight whose church the shroud was shown, and Marguerite de Charnay, the granddaughter of the knight of the Church of Leary. Neither of them only vaguely say in legal documents, my father obtained it in war, or if you're Marguerite, my grandfather obtained it. They don't have any other claim to that. So there's some say, well, it came from a dowry from the second wife of Charnay, but there's nothing in her will or in her diary that mentions a shroud. So that's where the question becomes, because it just sort of pops up. Okay, it pops up, but yet at the same time, it pops up in a milieu that is rife with passion devotion. It's not something that appears out of thin air. It does, but at the same time, it doesn't. It fits into this milieu of where you have the Black Plague going on. You have a lot of passion imagery. The Veil of Veronica is huge down in Rome. You have effigies of Christ that are like our sarcophagus in churches that are used for burial purposes. They use that. It has that same position of the shroud, of the man on the shroud. Passion art is blooming at this time, and I don't think you can simply say, well, all of that is because they were using the face on the shroud as the prototype. I think quite the contrary. It's part of this milieu, and I mean, we can get into it more, but that's, in general, that's the sort of intrigue. It pops up, but it also pops up in a place and time in which this is a very common image.
Yeah, this is, like you said, the mid 1300s. So we're still about 150 so years before Leonardo da Vinci comes into existence, and so we can just we'll just mark off that Da Vinci didn't make this. But like you said, it comes into existence into the pilgrim's eyes in the early 1300s.
I think it's important that you just said pilgrim's eyes, because I think that's, if we can just hone on that for a moment. This was a very active time for pilgrimage. We think of the Middle Ages perhaps as something where people are kind of in their peasantry and doing their thing and on their farm or whatever, or in their little fiefdom, and that's it. There was a lot of cross-cultural movement going on because of these pilgrim trails. So think about the Camino de Santiago, which is still very popular today, hugely popular today, secular and faith-like. That was also a very popular time frame. And so you had these stops along the pilgrim trails, multiple pilgrim trails that led you to the Camino in Spain. So if you were coming from Germany, you needed to cross France and places like that in order to get to Spain. So there were all ancillary trails, and the church in Leary is basically off one of those ancillary trails. So when you look at churches around that time, there was relics abound. Relics abounded in basically every church. Let me put it this way. In Strasbourg, off the Rhine River in modern-day France, Germany border, which is also a locus place for those effigies that I was saying, which are very Christ-like, very shroud-like, very visceral. If you look at some of these images, just like Strasbourg or Alsace, recumbent Christ. I did an article on it called "The Lost World of the Recumbent Christ." You see the veins kind of popping out of these carvings, and what's kind of amazing is that in where the lance wound is, that was sometimes used as a receptacle for the Eucharist during Good Friday meditations, which is just incredible, And those were some devotions that I found in my research that we've totally lost, by the way, that I wanted to bring out, because that was, to me, that was starting to become more interesting as a Catholic, as a man of faith, to bring that to modern day audiences than kind of maybe speculate on hypotheses of the shroud's origins that we don't really know. But we know tangibly that there was these things going on. For example, there was one where they had a movable crucifix, where the elbows would bend and things like that. And they installed on Good Friday, they installed a bag within the carving within and so when it would be recreated with the lance, there would be a bag of animal blood that would be in there. And so that would emerge. And pig's blood is very similar to human blood, by the way. But the Pilgrim Trail, there's a lot going on. And for instance, you had these relics. For instance, there's one nearby where it was relics of Lazarus in Avalon, France. You had, for instance, the Holy House of Loreto in Italy. I mean, how do you compete with this if you're a church that's vying for existence and you need donations, not because you're trying to get money from people, but you're just trying to survive as a church along the way. You need something that grabs people, and in some ways that the Shroud did that. And actually that's what caused its downfall at the time with the local bishop. But there was a lot of cross-cultural movement with the Pilgrim Trails and also with the Orthodox East, with Constantinople. When the Crusaders would go over to there, like for instance for the Fourth Crusade, you had these two worlds coming together, which had, as you know, were in excommunication since 1054. And there's always talk over the centuries of a possible union. Like, okay, we would so such and such emperor from Byzantium wants to unite with us, and the Pope would consider that. And it would always fall apart. But what's also interesting is that they weren't as foreign as you think, because you had these intermarriages amongst the noble families from the West. So there were these, yes, they may have been Orthodox in practice, but they were also Catholic marriages going on, which is very interesting. Serbia is very interesting in that way. And I did do a hypothesis that there may have been a transfer from Serbia of the Shroud to Charnay, who was on crusade in Turkey, East Italy, the Adriatic coast of Italy. Was a lot of movement between Serbia and the Orthodox East because of the ports, and that's where the Crusaders would leave. And so there could have been a lot of movement there. So anyway, the Pilgrim Trail and just a ton of it's just a fascinating, rich time.
It is. I mean, this is also during a time period where, like you said, France is pretty huge in the Catholic Church's history at the time. Lots of things are going on. The end of the Albigensian Crusade, the Templars in the early 1300s are disbanded. And then we get this scene where Pope Urban IV is elected Bishop of Rome, and he's from Naples. And this drives the French crazy because there's all these things going on in France, and there's a lot of French forward families running and jockeying for positions. And this is where we get the split, the Avignon popes.
So you have to take that into account, that is going on at the same time as the Shroud emerges in the historical record. So think about it. The area that we're talking about when the Shroud emerged is beholden to the Avignon Pope, who history will prove to be the anti-pope. Interestingly, that particular pope that we're speaking of, who was Cardinal Robert of Geneva, Clement VII, now we know him as anti-pope Clement VII, but he was the second cousin of Jeanne de Verger, who was Geoffrey de Charnay's second wife. So the claim that, it came from the Verger family, you think maybe Clement VII may have known that before or should have some insight. But he clearly has no idea about the cloth. We have communication about that with him and that he knows what's going on. I think it's also important to put into context the Shroud controversy that was emerging over this at the time out of Liry, out of Champagne. It was a very local problem. He had a lot of other issues going on. And we know at some point, I want to say maybe 6 years after the Shroud controversy, he died in 1394. At some point, a couple years later, he's dealing with another Shroud claim from another place. Okay, so this is just one of many issues that's going on at this time. He also wanted, we know this, right? He thought the Pope in Rome was poisonous, and he wanted to dismantle the Roman curia and really kind of consolidate the the papacy into his realm. I think that's telling. I think it's telling that at the same time that the schism happens, you had these jubilees going on in Rome, particularly the 1350 jubilee, which is huge. There was another one in 1390. The anti-popes, Clement VII, prohibited his people from going there. So Rome was under interdict. You could not travel. Edward III in England didn't want the English Catholics traveling because he didn't want the money leaving his lands. There was the 100 Years' War going on between England and France at the same time. So what was the big thing in Rome at the time of this Jubilee? It wasn't to go and see the Pope as it might be now. Did you see Pope Francis? It was to view the Veil of Veronica that was held in Rome, the Roman Veronica, which is still to this day in the 1st of May held up by clerics and shown to the faithful that first week of May. That was shown in 1350. There was estimated 1.2 million pilgrims. Some people were crushed to death on the bridge trying to view this thing. We have a drawing of it being held up. It's just the face cloth, remember, of this. If you're up in France and you're split from Holy Mother Church in Rome, and you're struggling to basically survive and stay relevant and claiming yourself to be the rightful, the rightful church, you might be thinking of a counter image that might draw some pilgrims away from Rome to your thing. Why not a full body image? Why does it just have to be the face? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and the Veil of Veronica is the relic attributed to being basically the face cloth that Jesus wipes his face on the way to be crucified. Is that correct?
It's correct, which is not in the gospel, so it's an apocryphal story. I think it's interesting. The shroud is not alone in this. There's an entire devotion to the holy face, that stretches way farther back than the shroud. Now, there's an argument made that the shroud was the holy face folded up 4 times, and that all you saw was the face of the man on the shroud, and that in 1350 someone decided to open the whole thing up, and lo and behold, it's the whole body image. So the holy face. Wow, what do we have here? The holy face. The holy face devotion, by the way, stretches back to this idea that Akbar V, was sick, and then he wrote a letter to Jesus, and Jesus wrote a letter back to him and gave him and put his face on a cloth, and he was thus healed. I think it's important to note that the Veronica legend of wiping his face on the road, on the Via Doloroso, is the closest that the Holy Face iconography has gotten to linking the Holy Face with Calvary. It has nothing to do with the entombed Christ. Although there is, as we know in John 20, there is the face cloth wrapped up off to the side that's mentioned. But it's important to say, I just have to say it, the Gospels make no mention of an image on these burial cloths.
Yeah, and then as we trace the history of this, it ends up basically being in the Savoy family. And that's where it remains all the way until it becomes part of the Holy See in the 80s.
Yeah, so and it was under the Savoy in which the legend or the reputation of the shroud exploded on the world stage, because they saw it as a way of peddling their own reputation. Now, this is the same noble family that became the monarchs of Italy. They're kinsmen of Charnay. Marguerite de Charnay, as I mentioned, the granddaughter of Geoffrey. This is where I have some red flags. She is becoming an old lady. She has no children. She's gone through 2 marriages, produced no children. Now she's a widow. She's getting near the end of her life. She has been holding on to this cloth, and she's kind of been journeying around France. She really doesn't have a home anymore because there's a legal battle going on from the canons of Lurie,
and she's excommunicated, so she can't go to church.
She's peripatetic and she's excommunicated. She's a wandering soul. She is, and the courts are basically saying you have to give this cloth back to the canons. Which is interesting to me because if you were really trying to say, well, the shroud is from my family, or it was obtained by my family, or it was given to my family by the king or something like that, then you would be able to show that. You were able to prove that in the court of law. She was never able to do that. So she was sort of like on the run. She was sort of on the lam from returning this cloth to the canons. She returned the other relics that belonged in Leary into the Leary church, except for the shroud. She knows she has to give it up. She finds it in the house of Savoy, which you can kind of connect. By the way, her kinsman, as I mentioned, there's a familiar connection there, and it was the Savoy who, over the next 500 years, really turned. You know what they did, and this is where the intrigue continues. They kept it hidden, and they would only bring it out every once in a while. To great fanfare. And we've seen the engravings, we've seen the pictures where they showed it to this huge crowd, and it's like, whoa, that really helped solidify the shroud as this incredible, strange object. And it was under the Savoy when they let it be photographed for the first time in 1898. And also, so those images really were the next level for the shroud, for those images to be splashed on newspapers and things like that. Specifically the negative face image. But I want to just tie that in because there was two periods of the shroud in the 20th century. The first was examining, once those pictures came out, examining the image as a crucified image. How did that happen? It's Pierre Barbet, a doctor of Calvary, that sort of thing, kind of examining the shroud as a man who underwent crucifixion. The second stage of the shroud in the 20th century into our time was as a relic of the resurrection. But all that was possible because of Savoy. In 1946, Umberto abdicated as king of Italy. He lived out his time in Portugal, and upon his death in 1983, he gave it back bequeathed it to the Holy See of Formerly, which had been in Turin since the 1500s.
Once it gets back to the Holy See, it basically goes into obscurity from there.
So, well, sort of. Think about it. So officially it gets. So yes, I mean they still retain this idea of keeping it kind of under lock and key and away from sight. Yeah. So the expositions were still very rare, but it was within 5 years of formally being given over to the Holy See or to the Archdiocese of Turin, it was carbon dated. So it's very interesting, the Savoy had no interest in wanting to have any to photograph it was, kind of a big deal, but I think it says something about the church being able to say, sure, you want to do something with it scientifically, go for it. And to my knowledge, that carbon dating was the last formally approved test.
That was in the 70s.
That was in 88.
Before then, we actually have an examination of the shroud done in the early 1900s. Well, it was published in the early 1900s. So let's just talk about the details of the shroud. It's 2024. I mean, come on, everybody's seen what the shroud is, but let's just talk about some of these details that are very peculiar about it.
It's obviously a representation of the crucified Christ. I suppose you could say that it's pretty well detailed. I think once yeah, I mean, it's a visual gospel. It's a visual gospel. To me, it's a teaching tool on the one hand. I mean, you can really see it checks all the boxes. It's got you see the wrist wound or the hand wound or the wrist wound, wherever that splash coming out of the hand is. I mean, obviously the nail, there's the lance wound. I mean, there's the apparently marks of scourging on the front and back. It's an entombed, he's very, charitably, he's got his hands covering. So that's a nice touch. It's an entombed. It's a picture of the entombed Christ. Uh, in the early 1900s, when the first images came out from photography, there was a thought that maybe, well, how did this image get on there? That was always the big question. And in the early 1900s, Paul Vignon and others thought it was like some kind of vapograph thing. It was like all the aloes and the myrrhs kind of, and the sweat. It's interesting. Sudarium, which sometimes we hear of that. The sudarium. That literally means sweat cloth. So there's a whole tradition that the shroud was a kind of sweat object, but more scientific minds prevailed as time went on and said, no, this is it got to the point now where it's this radiation idea that, energy from the body at the moment of resurrection blasted in a split second, onto the cloth as the body is passing through the cloth. At that point, I'm sorry. I almost wonder if are we, I hate to say this in a way that I know I don't want to offend anybody because I know it's a big deal to a lot of people, but are we taking out the mystery of the resurrection a little bit, maybe? By postulating this without taking into account all of that this was being held by an excommunicated lay person in the 1300s, who didn't want to give it back to the canons. Anyway, but yeah, that's kind of in a brief overview that's what's on the cloth.
Well, we speak anthropologically. I guess we could speak about that. We could say archaeologically, this is how the individual was displayed on the shroud. Like you said, hands over the intimate parts, and one piece over and under. Where if we were to read and examine burial rituals of the first century, we'll just say the first century Middle East, the arms were either crossed over the chest or laid next to the body. They weren't draped over the intimate parts. That seems to kind of be from a sense of modesty, right? I mean, this is probably a Middle Ages modesty representation, right?
Oh yeah, that's kind of look at gosh, I wish I can show you some images, but if you look at, say, for instance, there was a sculpture from 1753. I believe it's displayed in Paris. I don't think it's the Louvre, but it's called the Veiled Christ. The Veiled Christ, 1753. It's this marble sculpture which is very Michelangelo-ish, but that feels like a crucified body. If you look at that. Now, going back to the Levant, I quote and interviewed Dr. Orit Shamir of the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, who concluded that the cloth was not from the land of Israel in the Roman or medieval period, based on the textile fashioning of the weave and such. Champagne, where the cloth did emerge, was known for its annual trade fairs. It was a huge textile production area. Flanders nearby was as well. So, like I said, you can get into a deadlock about this and that sort of thing. But the point is that there is no image like that for 1400 years in our tradition. It's not in the Gospels. It's not in the early apocryphal works. It's not in any New Testament letter. If it was, I really think it would have changed. It would have changed the idea of faith. Do you need the book if you have the cloth? I think it's all the mystery of faith, as we say, the mysterium fidei, right? There's more to that than just trying to say, well, all your answers are here on the Shroud of Turin. There's just more. There's more mystery. Our faith is a faith of mystery.
The manner in which the faith was spread in the first centuries wasn't obviously through a text. I mean, say somebody in the year 200, hey, present me with your Bible. I mean, that's not going to happen. But you're absolutely right. I don't find any documentation of any of the early church fathers, any of the early church saints saying, we are keeping this shroud of our Lord in protect. I mean, there's not even an apocryphal story of Joseph of Arimathea going to England with the shroud. I mean, that would be something you would think would occur.
That's where I think you might want to say, well, it was actually the Grail. Now, which is there's things about that too. And I do a chapter on the Grail, which is an odd. Let's face it, it's an odd thing to kind of reconcile the Grail with our faith. And I think official Holy Mother Church is wise in. It's so many legends and stories exist out there. And that's what I always loved about the wisdom of the church, is that it kind of just lets things be. And it does weigh in on occasion on things, but it also kind of lets things happen. I mean, look at 20 years ago, Brandon, with the Da Vinci Code and the claims, which were not new, but there was a storm there, but the storm passed. I mean, these things come and go. But the mystery of faith remains, and that's what's just beautiful about it, personally.
Faith speaks to a much more intimate part of our soul than some kind of scientific item or relic. I mean, it even drove somebody in the early 1900s to say that there isn't a day that goes by that miracles aren't manufactured for the faithful. And so it drives you to ask something like, the shroud's being examined in the early 1900s. Well, there's other things going on around the world in the 1900s. I mean, gosh, dude, Spiritism is huge in the 1900s. You got massive occultists coming out of the woodwork, I guess you could say. And they're all bringing their own form of miracle, either they're hearing voices from whatever, or they're channeling spirits. So you have people literally manufacturing miracles. And at the same time, there's somebody looking at the shroud going, I don't know what to say about this thing. And so the church remains, like you said, it weighs in, and it doesn't, lets things be. And that's entirely what you would expect from a faith driven by the mystery of something like the resurrection. The life, death, and resurrection of Christ is a mystery to us. Whereas all these other things are popping up and they're giving us miracles of this person hearing from this spirit. I mean, it's like you have to drive an audience somewhere on a pilgrimage of belief. And what's going on? What would be the impetus of pushing something like the shroud? We spoke way early on that these guys are using this thing in Avignon, France, to bolster the French papacy.
Wow. Before we're done today, I do want to talk about my hypothesis about why the shroud emerged. But I want to deviate, because I think what you talked about is really important, because I've been studying this too. And this is that idea of what you said, like spiritualism and a kind of neo-Gnosticism, which emerged in the 20th century and into our time. Corresponding, say, with full gospel and Pentecostal healings and the move.
Azusa Street in California.
Exactly right. I've been this especially down in Southern California. What's very interesting is that I never really got into this before until a couple of years ago, was the movement of the old Catholic Church. Are you familiar with that to a degree?
There is actually in a town nearby that has one of the old Catholic churches.
Yeah. How would you define that then? Because those have offshoots too. Do you know what?
I don't know very much about them. In fact, my ignorance about a lot of these branches would even include sedevacantism. So, like, I know that literally means the chair of Peter is vacant, right? So, I mean, that's like my limited knowledge on that.
Now, we're treating this, by the way, with we're being actually kind of respectful times, talking about the old Catholic Church as being a legitimate sort of. You know what I found is that a lot of these fringe old Catholics who claim to be clerics are complete frauds. They went to fake schools. They peddled fake diplomas, and then they made each other bishops. And they said, well, because this offshoot bishop who got who left Holy Mother Church, because he was made a bishop while he was still within Rome, he still has the capability to make bishops on his own accord. So he can make anyone who wants to be, any guy off the street can be made a bishop. And thus they formed their own churches. So it's not just Protestantism, which has these thousands of offshoots. The old Catholic Church has their own. It's a mill, and it's quite amazing. And I won't get into this too much, but I got to tell you, I found a whole group of these old Catholics connected to the Kennedy assassination out of New Orleans. There was a way of appearing legitimate and able to raise money and to wear the collar and to wear the cloths and to be able to kind of travel without anyone thinking otherwise. And for that, they were charlatans. They were professional con men who found a way in by going into this church. And so not only were these fake bishops, fake schools, fake churches, but also fake chivalric orders, to the point where they were confusing. If you look at like newspapers.com, when I was doing my research, these newspaper articles were quoting, thinking that this was the actual Order of Malta, when it was a total sham, so it was a great cover to do very, very controversial and criminal things. So I just have to say that.
Well, I mean, there's a parallel going on in the 80s, or the 70s, 80s, with an Eastern Orthodox church making bishops in the Bronx. Peter Levenda was one of these individuals that was a made-up bishop. And so, I mean, that's just an example. This is a thing, right? This is like a thing. People do this, and they gain some kind of universal church recognition or something.
Well, Levenda, even before the 70s and 80s, I mean, Levenda knows some of these people who are involved with, who are suspects in the Kennedy assassination.
So you have a theory, and you talked about that. Let's address that quickly here.
I just want to mention that Jeffrey Descharnay, who was the first. Sorry, my daughter's struggling. Hang on a second. Jeffrey Descharnay is supposedly the first owner of the Shroud. He was a soldier. He was a knight. He served the Dukes of Burgundy and the King of France, and he died in the Battle of Poitiers in September of 1356. Now, we have documentation of him wanting to build a church in one of his fiefdoms, which was Liry. Okay. We have all that. We have the building of the church. We have all the back and forths with it. Never a mention of a shroud, by the way. He wanted to be buried there. He wanted to have a cemetery at this church. He wanted to be buried there when the time came. The Battle of Poitiers takes his life. He's protecting King John the Good. His body's never returned to Liry as per his wish. He was one of almost 3,000 who died in that battle. He had a formal funeral 14 years later, a kind of ceremony at a church in Paris that King Charles allowed. But again, his body was never returned to Liry. He has canons who are running the church in Liry, about 5 canons or so. They have relics and things like that. If you're one of those canons, and your principal donor dies, you're left now with being like, what do we do? Because he was the principal founder of the church. He was the guy who funded it. He's gone. And we know there were financial problems because his wife was asking for money from the king. So, and luckily we have the Bishop Diarchus memorandum which if you read Appendix A of my book, is one of the few times in English that the whole letter is published, by the way, the whole complete letter. And it talks about how the canons that commissioned an artist to create this cloth. To me, what better way to commemorate the founder of your church than by showing his body isn't there? The Holy Sepulchre is empty, and so is the cemetery in Leary. What better way to link the founder of the Leary Church with the crucified Christ than by contemplating an image of the crucified? We know from a 1500s document, which I just had put up in my Medium, an article that I had done called "I'm a Catholic and I Believe that the Shroud is Fake." We have a document from the 1500s that they were still that the canons were still commemorating his death at that time by displaying a funeral cloth every year on his death. To me, that sounds very much like what they did with the shroud when they had in their possession. It seems to me why they wanted it, why they claimed it was theirs, why they were fighting the Charnay family for it. And that lines up exactly with the Diarchus memo. And it fits into a whole tradition of memento moris, drat mortuaires, transies. You look up all that those are images of a crucified, which are commemorated in places like a church. So all of that presents itself to me as potentially why the shroud existed, where it did, when it did, and why it did.
When we examine and listen and read about this cloth, we have all these ideas on how it came to be, a photographic negative or painted on, or a variety of different things. And like you said, it's very polarizing. It is, to me, to cling to an item, let's say the relic or the Shroud of Turin, being a leftover artifact from Christ's resurrection. To cling to that, having to be that, or having to have that as a stone, a foundation stone to build any kind of faith on, is to me almost shaky as saying the first 2 chapters of Genesis must be literal and the world was created in 6 literal 1,000-year days. Otherwise, all of the Old Testament is false and our whole faith is built upon, rubble or some lies or something. And there's more to it than that, right? I mean, John says in his epistle that all of this stuff he gave John wrote down because they got to touch him. They saw him with their own eyes. They were with him and spoke to him and heard his own voice. And they wanted to leave that in a record, a written record, that it was there. But that wasn't how faith was transmitted for the first couple hundred years of the faith. It was, sure, the letters were read, but it was, first people saying, "Hey, let me tell you about Jesus."
Yeah, that was very important to me because I'm from a church in Ohio where I was born and raised and had all my sacraments at St. Michael Church in Independence, Ohio. So I really wanted to do homage to the legacy of that great archangel, and I learned a lot. I didn't know really much about the wonderful traditions, in both the Hebrew Bible and our faith too. Michael is a very wonderful link between those two faiths. So it is by far my most selling book currently. That came out in 2020 from our Sunday Visitor. Yeah.
Being the Prince of the Peoples of Israel was kind of an interesting. The devotion that Pope Leo, I'm going to say the 13th, hopefully that's not wrong.
That's right.
Pope Leo the 13th, clearly seeing something going on and says, hey, this prayer needs to be prayed.
That's great, because that's what Pope Leo the 13th advised. That was what the whole Leonine prayers that were created, written by him. it was a way. It was a universal. It was a way that the faiths were united around the world through these prayers, and it's been organically returning in the last 5 or 6 years by those who've desired to want to bring it back.
Well, let's ask the question on where people can find more of James Day and what you have coming up.
Yeah, well, I would, you can find me on Amazon. I also have a Medium page, jamesfday.medium.com. A lot of that has been more about my ongoing JFK research. And I've been reading more into these fake orders and the old Catholic Church as a criminal enterprise, as a way of charlatans to kind of sneak in under these auspices of legitimacy as a way to propagate their enterprise. And it's been quite amazing because I've actually I'm close, but I'm not there yet. A lot of these suspects that I've pegged in the Kennedy assassination emerge in the Vatican bank scandal of the 70s and 80s. So I don't think that's ever been connected before, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, there's all sorts of really interesting tie-ins, just to entertain this for a minute, tie-ins with criminal organization and religious bodies, either criminal or the other one that's really common is intelligence, right? Intelligence agencies are really invested in, for example, the Process Church of the Final Judgment is probably one of the biggest.
Is that Brian? Or is that Anton? Sorry, that's shown up in my research too. But that's Anton LaVey, isn't it?
Started the Church of Satan. Yeah, this was started by Mary Ann McLean and Robert de Grimston in '66 in London. And then they spread to New Orleans, and this is an interesting one. I just had a conversation about it. And the fact is we have intelligence agencies utilizing religious methodologies, ideologies to push things forward. The process is actually a branch and a split from the Church of Scientology. And the Church of Scientology has its roots with L. Ron Hubbard, who had ties in with Jack Parsons, which doesn't take a very long finding. He's our rocket man, and he's OTO, and then for OTO, that's Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was a member of the intelligence operation of the Queen. It doesn't take very long to just start to descend and find out that a lot of these massive esotericists, occultists, are in fact intelligence operatives of England or other agencies around the world.
Wow, that's amazing. And just quickly, I'll say we know that the CIA utilized religious movements as a way of getting into, say, South America or Latin America. You have a chance of getting better in here than we do. So we'll fund your mission, but we're going to tell you where to go. We know the CIA did this with the Father Peyton's Rosary Crusade. They told him where he was going to go, and in exchange for he's in there, and under his cover, we would swoop in and do our deeds.
Yeah, it's either through religious movements or disenfranchised groups of individuals, something like Manson and the hippie movement, the utilization of individuals who are typically liberal, extreme liberal in their ideologies, which has been shown to be easier to brainwash, according to many research documents.
Oh, hypnotism is hand in hand with this. Yeah. And so I'd be very cautious when you look at hypnotism and RFK's assassination, for instance, and other means of annihilation.
Fantastic, man. Thanks for coming on the show and having a chat with me. It's been a really good conversation about the fraud of Turin and other little knickknacks.
Brandon, thank you, and best wishes on going forward on your work.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.